My husband Stefan and his brother Rick thought it'd be funny to abandon me in Vegas after I questioned their gambling habits. "Let's see how the princess gets home," they laughed, speeding away in our rental car. They expected me back in Boston within days, broke and begging. 6 months later, when Stefan tracked me down, I was sitting in the VIP section of the Bellagio, negotiating a 7-figure consulting contract. Let's see who got the last laugh. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us. The morning it all went wrong started like any other day of our anniversary trip to Las Vegas. Stefan Gilbert had surprised me with the getaway, claiming he wanted to celebrate our 8 years of marriage somewhere exciting. What I didn't realize was that his brother Rick had been planning to join us all along, turning our romantic weekend into another one of their juvenile adventures. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. Back in Boston, I was Bridget Gilbert, the dutiful wife who managed our pristine Beacon Hill townhouse while Stefan built his reputation as a corporate attorney. I'd abandoned my own career in financial analysis 3 years into our marriage when Stefan convinced me that his demanding schedule required a full-time support system at home. "Think of yourself as the CEO of our domestic operations," he'd said with that charming smile that had won me over in law school. For 5 years, I'd thrown myself into that role with the same analytical precision I'd once applied to market trends and investment portfolios. I managed Stefan's complex social calendar, entertained his colleagues and clients with carefully orchestrated dinner parties, and maintained the image of success that his law firm expected from its partners' wives. My days were filled with personal shopping, charity luncheons, and the endless maintenance required to keep Stefan's world running smoothly. But lately, something had been shifting inside me. Maybe it was watching my former classmates advance in their careers while I arranged flowers and selected wine pairings. Maybe it was the way Stefan had started dismissing my opinions even on household matters, as if my brain had atrophied from disuse. Or maybe it was discovering the credit card statements that showed increasingly frequent business lunches at expensive restaurants I'd never heard of, often on days when Stefan claimed to be working late at the office. The Vegas trip was supposed to be a reset for us, a chance to reconnect away from the pressures of Boston society. Stefan had booked us into a luxurious suite at the Wynn, promising spa treatments, shows, and quiet dinners where we could remember why we'd fallen in love. I'd packed my best dresses and allowed myself to hope that we might rediscover the partnership we'd once shared. The first red flag should have been Rick's unexpected appearance at our hotel room on Friday evening. Stefan's younger brother had always been the family wild card, charming but unreliable, brilliant but unfocused, constantly scheming his way out of whatever mess he'd created most recently. At 32, he still lived off a combination of get-rich-quick schemes, occasional consulting work, and what I suspected were regular bailouts from Stefan. "Surprise!" Rick had announced, barging into our suite with his trademark grin and an expensive bottle of champagne that he'd probably charged to Stefan's credit card. Vegas isn't Vegas without the Gilbert brothers taking on the town together. Stefan's face had lit up in a way I rarely saw anymore, and I realized with a sinking heart that this reunion had been planned. The romantic weekend I'd been anticipating evaporated as the brothers fell into their familiar dynamic, Stefan, the successful older brother, Rick, the charming rebel, and me relegated to the role of disapproving wife, who didn't understand their special bond. That first evening set the tone for what would become a nightmare weekend. The brothers hit the casino floors with the enthusiasm of teenagers, throwing money around with abandon while I trailed behind them like a reluctant chaperone. Stefan, usually so controlled and calculating in his professional life, became reckless under Rick's influence, doubling down on losing bets and ordering round after round of top-shelf whiskey. By Saturday night, I'd watched them lose more money than I'd ever seen spent so carelessly. When I quietly suggested to Stefan that perhaps they should slow down, Rick had laughed loudly enough to attract stares from other gamblers. "Bridget, honey, you're killing the vibe," he'd said, throwing an arm around Stefan's shoulders. "This is guy time. Why don't you go get a massage or buy yourself something pretty?" The dismissal stung, but what hurt more was seeing Stefan nod in agreement rather than defending me. I'd spent the rest of the evening nursing a single drink at the bar, watching my husband and his brother spiral deeper into their gambling frenzy while I felt increasingly invisible. Sunday had brought no improvement. If anything, the brothers seemed more determined to prove their invincibility. moving from blackjack to poker to craps with mounting losses and decreasing judgment. By afternoon, I could see the strain in Stefan's face despite his forced laughter, and I suspected they were approaching the limits of whatever credit lines they'd established. When I'd approached them at the roulette table, intending to suggest we grab dinner and talk about heading home, Rick had turned to me with glassy eyes and a mean smile. Jesus, Stefan, does she always hover like this? No wonder you need these trips to feel alive again. The comment had hit its target perfectly. Stefan's jaw tightened, and I saw something cold flash in his eyes as he looked at me. In that moment, I realized that I hadn't been invited on this trip to reconnect with my husband. I'd been brought along to serve as a foil, someone Rick could mock and Stefan could rebel against to prove his brotherhood loyalty. She's been nagging all weekend, Stefan had replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the casino noise. Always worried about money, always trying to control everything, can't just let a man enjoy himself. The words felt like a physical blow. After 8 years of supporting his career, managing his life, and sacrificing my own ambitions for his success, I'd been reduced to a nagging wife who didn't understand fun. Standing there in the glittering casino, surrounded by the sounds of winning and losing, I felt something inside me snap. Maybe I should just go back to the room, I'd said quietly, giving Stefan one last chance to remember who I was and what I'd given up for him. Instead, he'd turned back to the roulette table without even acknowledging I'd spoken. Rick had laughed, slapping Stefan on the back in approval of his dismissal. That's when I'd made my fatal mistake. I'd reached out and touched Stefan's arm, trying once more to break through whatever spell his brother had cast. Stefan, please, we need to talk about this. This isn't like you. What happened next would change everything. Stefan had whirled around so suddenly that I'd stumbled backward, his face flushed with alcohol and embarrassment. The other gamblers around the roulette table had turned to watch our domestic drama unfold, their curious eyes making the moment even more humiliating. You know what, Bridget, you're absolutely right. This isn't like me, Stefan had said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The me you know sits in meetings all day and comes home to discuss paint swatches and dinner parties. But this is who I used to be before I got married and forgot how to have fun. Rick had sensed an opportunity and pounced on it with the predatory instincts that had gotten him through years of talking his way out of consequences. Dude, remember Vegas before you got married? That legendary weekend when we… Don't, Stefan had cut him off, but his eyes had lit up with the memory. God, we were kings that weekend. No schedules, no responsibilities, no one telling us what we could and couldn't do. The comparison was clear, and it stung. I was the responsibility, the schedule, the voice of caution that had apparently been suffocating Stefan for years without my realizing it. The crowd around us had grown larger, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold, and I'd felt my cheeks burning with humiliation. Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere private, I'd suggested, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. Why? Rick had interjected, his voice carrying that edge of cruelty that had always made me uncomfortable. Afraid people might see the real dynamic here? That your husband might remember what it feels like to be a man instead of a… What did you call yourself, the CEO of domestic operations? The words had hit like ice water. Somehow Rick knew about the conversation Stefan and I had had years ago about my role in our marriage. Stefan must have told him, probably laughing about how easily I'd accepted the title that made my sacrifice sound important, while keeping me firmly in my place. Stefan, I'd said, my voice smaller now, pleading, you told him about that? Instead of shame or regret, Stefan's face had hardened further. I tell Rick everything. He's my brother. He knew me before I became this domesticated version of myself. Domesticated? Rick had repeated with obvious relish. That's perfect, like a wild animal that's been trained to do tricks. He gestured toward me with his whiskey glass. Sit, Bridget, stay. Manage the social calendar. The crowd had actually laughed, and I'd felt something die inside me. These weren't strangers mocking a private moment. These were people who would remember this story, who would tell their friends about the pathetic wife who got humiliated by her husband and his brother in front of half the casino. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm going back to the room," I'd announced, turning to leave with what little dignity I could muster. "Actually, no," Stefan had said, and something in his tone had made me freeze. "Rick and I have been talking, and we think you need to learn something about independence. About not always having someone to bail you out of every situation." I'd turned back slowly, not liking the gleam in Rick's eyes or the set of Stefan's jaw. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Stefan had continued, pulling out his wallet and extracting my credit cards, the ones he'd offered to carry because my small purse had been too full, "that maybe you should figure out how to get home on your own for once, without running to Daddy Stefan to solve all your problems." The world had seemed to tilt around me as I realized what he was suggesting. "Stefan, you can't be serious. We're 3,000 miles from home." "Dead serious," Rick had chimed in, clearly enjoying himself. "Think of it as a life lesson. You're always talking about being so capable, so organized. Prove it." I had looked desperately at Stefan, searching for any sign that this was just another one of Rick's cruel jokes that had gone too far. But my husband's face had been cold, resolved, as if he'd been thinking about this moment for much longer than the few minutes since our argument had started. "You have your phone," Stefan had said with the same tone he used when explaining legal concepts to clients. "You're a grown woman. Figure it out." "My cards are in your wallet," I'd whispered, the full scope of their plan becoming clear. "I have maybe $40 in cash." "Then you'll have to be creative," Rick had said with a shrug. "Maybe this will teach you not to take everything for granted." The crowd around us had gone silent, sensing that this had moved beyond entertainment into something genuinely cruel. I'd seen a few uncomfortable faces, people who clearly thought the brothers had crossed a line, but no one had intervened. "Stefan, please," I'd tried one last time, my voice breaking. "Don't do this. Not like this. Not in front of all these people." For just a moment, I'd thought I'd seen a flicker of the man I'd married, a hint of regret in his eyes. But then Rick had leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and Stefan's expression had hardened again. "Come on, Rick," Stefan had said, pocketing my credit cards. "Let's go find a real game. Somewhere with higher stakes and fewer distractions." They'd walked away together, leaving me standing in the middle of the casino floor with dozens of strangers staring at me with mixtures of pity, shock, and second-hand embarrassment. I'd stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for Stefan to come back, to tell me it had been a stupid joke that had gone too far. But he didn't come back. Instead, I'd watched from across the casino floor as he and Rick settled into a high-stakes poker game, laughing and ordering drinks as if nothing had happened. As if I didn't exist. That's when the full reality of my situation had hit me. I was alone in Las Vegas with $43 in cash, no credit cards, no rental car, and a husband who had just publicly humiliated me before abandoning me to teach me some twisted lesson about independence. The worst part wasn't the money or even the abandonment. It was the realization that this cruelty had been planned, discussed between the brothers like a strategy session. Stefan hadn't just lost his temper in a moment of drunken stupidity. He'd deliberately orchestrated my humiliation. Standing there in the glittering chaos of the casino, I'd felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had spent 5 years managing Stefan's life, who had sacrificed her career and dreams to support his ambitions, who had made herself smaller to make him feel bigger, that woman was finished. What rose in her place was someone I hadn't been in years, Bridget Seymour, the financial analyst who had once been known for her ability to calculate risk and spot opportunities that others missed. And as I'd looked around the casino with new eyes, I'd begun to see possibilities instead of just desperation. I spent the first hour after Stefan and Rick walked away convincing myself this was all an elaborate test. Maybe Stefan was watching from across the casino, timing how long it would take me to break down and come crawling back to him. Maybe this was his twisted way of proving that I needed him more than he needed me, and once I'd learned my lesson, he'd swoop in to rescue me with that patronizing smile I'd grown to recognize over the years. I found a quiet corner near the hotel lobby and pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Stefan's number. It went straight to voicemail. His professional recording played back at me in that smooth, confident tone he used for clients. "You've reached Stefan Gilbert at Gilbert & Associates. Please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call within 24 hours. "Stefan, it's me," I said after the beep, trying to keep my voice steady. "This has gone far enough. I know you're angry, but abandoning me here isn't solving anything. Please call me back so we can talk about this like adults." I hung up and waited, watching the entrance to the casino area where I'd last seen him and Rick. Surely he'd check his phone soon. Surely he'd realize this had crossed a line from teaching me a lesson into genuine cruelty. 20 minutes passed with no response. I tried calling again, and again it went to voicemail. This time I could hear the slight tremor in my voice as I spoke. "Stefan, please. I don't understand what I did that was so wrong. If you're upset about me questioning your gambling, we can discuss that. But leaving me stranded like this isn't fair. I'm your wife, not some stranger you met at a bar. Please just call me back." The third call, an hour later, produced the same result. By now, other hotel guests were starting to stare at me. A well-dressed woman sitting alone in the lobby, clutching her phone and looking increasingly desperate. I moved to a different seating area, but the feeling of being watched, judged, followed me. That's when I decided to go looking for them directly. I'd find Stefan and Rick, force them to confront what they'd done, and demand my credit cards back. I knew Stefan's tells from years of watching him negotiate. He always touched his left cufflink when he was bluffing or felt guilty. I'd see that gesture, know he regretted this stupid game, and we'd all laugh about it later. The casino floor was vast and overwhelming, a maze of flashing lights, electronic sounds, and cigarette smoke that made my eyes water. I wandered from section to section, checking every poker table, every blackjack game, every craps table, where men in expensive suits threw money around like confetti. Twice I thought I spotted Stefan's distinctive profile, but when I got closer, it was always a stranger who looked nothing like my husband up close. After 2 hours of searching, I finally found them at a private poker room accessible only through a velvet rope and a stern-looking security guard. Through the glass walls, I could see Stefan and Rick laughing at something one of the other players had said, their body language relaxed and carefree. Stefan had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, his serious gambling look that I'd seen during their occasional guys' nights back in Boston. I approached the security guard, a mountain of a man in an ill-fitting black suit. "Excuse me, I need to speak to my husband," I said, pointing toward Stefan, the man in the blue shirt at table 3. The guard looked me up and down, his expression skeptical. "This is a private game, ma'am. No interruptions allowed." "I understand, but it's urgent. I just need 2 minutes." "No interruptions," he repeated, his tone making it clear that further argument would be pointless. I stood there for another hour, watching through the glass as Stefan played hand after hand, never once looking toward the entrance where I waited. At one point, Rick glanced over and saw me standing there. He nudged Stefan, pointed in my direction, and said something that made both brothers laugh. Stefan looked directly at me for a long moment, then deliberately turned his back and ordered another drink. The message was unmistakable. I could stand there all night, and he wouldn't acknowledge my existence. This wasn't a lesson or a test, it was a statement. In Stefan's mind, I had become so needy, so dependent, so burdensome, that he could simply discard me and continue his life as if I'd never existed. I tried calling Rick's number next, a number I'd only used for family emergencies in the past. His phone went straight to voicemail too, but unlike Stefan's professional message, Rick's was pure him. "Rick here. If you're calling about money I owe you, I'm probably avoiding you. If you're calling about money you owe me, leave details. If you're my mother, I'm fine and I'll call you back eventually. Maybe." "Rick, it's Bridget," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "I know you two are upset with me, but this isn't funny anymore. I need my credit cards back. I need a way to get home. Please don't let this go any further." No response. I called Stefan's office line, thinking maybe he'd check those messages out of habit. Then I tried calling the hotel room, in case they decided to go back upstairs. Each unanswered ring felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage, another confirmation that the man I'd spent 8 years of my life supporting had planned this humiliation with his brother. By midnight, I'd called Stefan's number 17 times, Rick's number 11 times, the hotel room 4 times. Each call went to voicemail or rang endlessly, and with each non-response, the reality of my situation became clearer. This wasn't an impulsive act of anger that Stefan would regret in the morning. This was a deliberate decision, probably planned before we'd even left Boston. Maybe the whole anniversary trip had been a setup, a way to get me far from home and our support systems, so the brothers could execute whatever lesson they thought I needed to learn. As I sat in that hotel lobby at 1 a.m., watching well-dressed couples return from shows and dinners, I felt the last of my hope crumble away. Stefan wasn't coming to rescue me. He wasn't having second thoughts or feeling guilty about what he'd done. I was truly on my own, 3,000 miles from home, with less than $50 to my name. But as that reality settled over me like a lead blanket, something else began to emerge from beneath the fear and humiliation. It was small at first, just a whisper in the back of my mind, but it grew stronger with each passing minute. For the first time in years, no one was telling me what to do, where to go, or how to think. For the first time in years, I was free. The morning sun streaming through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows felt like an assault on my senses. I'd spent the night dozing fitfully in an oversized leather chair, jolting awake every time security made their rounds or a group of late-night gamblers stumbled past. My designer dress was wrinkled, my carefully styled hair had fallen into a tangled mess, and my makeup had smeared beneath my eyes, giving me the appearance of exactly what I was. A desperate woman who'd been abandoned with nowhere to go. At 6 a.m., I'd finally swallowed my pride and approached the front desk, hoping against hope that Stefan had left some kind of message or instruction for me. The desk clerk, a young woman named Jessica whose name tag indicated she was from Nebraska, looked at me with barely concealed pity as she pulled up our reservation. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Gilbert, but there are no messages for you," she said, her voice professionally kind but cautious. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" I wanted to explain the situation, to pour out the whole humiliating story to this stranger who might offer some sympathy or solution, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell someone that your husband of 8 years had abandoned you in a casino as entertainment for his brother? Is my husband still checked into the room? I asked instead, clinging to the possibility that Stefan was upstairs, perhaps nursing a hangover and second thoughts about what he'd done. Jessica's fingers clicked across her keyboard, and I watched her expression shift slightly. "Mr. Gilbert checked out this morning at 5:47 a.m., both guests on the reservation." The words hit me like a physical blow. Stefan and Rick had packed their bags and left while I was sitting in the lobby, probably walking past me on their way to the airport while I dozed in that chair. They'd gotten up early specifically to avoid any possibility of running into me, of having to confront what they'd done in the harsh light of sobriety. Did they leave anything for me?" I whispered, knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. "I'm sorry, no, nothing was left for any other guests." I thanked Jessica and walked away on unsteady legs, the full scope of my abandonment finally sinking in. Stefan hadn't just taken my credit cards and left me in the casino. He'd planned his escape, booked a flight home, and executed his departure with the same cold efficiency he brought to his legal cases. I retreated to a bathroom near the hotel restaurant and stared at myself in the unforgiving fluorescent light. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the confident wife who'd arrived in Vegas 2 days earlier. This woman looked haunted, desperate, like someone you'd cross the street to avoid. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to assess my resources objectively, the way I used to analyze portfolios back when I had a career. $43 in cash. A cell phone with about 60% battery remaining. The clothes on my back, which included uncomfortable designer heels that were already giving me blisters. A small purse with some makeup, breath mints, and a hotel key card that would expire at checkout time. That was it. That was everything I had to rebuild my life with. I pulled up my banking app, though I knew what I'd find. Stefan had been the primary account holder on all our finances, something we'd arranged years ago when I'd stopped working, and he'd convinced me it would be simpler to consolidate everything under his management. My access was limited to viewing balances and recent transactions, but I couldn't transfer money or make major purchases without his authorization. The joint checking account showed a balance of $43,847.22. Our savings account held $127,891.85. Our investment portfolio, which I'd helped build back when I still worked in finance, was worth over $400,000. All of it completely inaccessible to me without Stefan's signature or presence. I'd helped build that wealth. My financial knowledge had guided many of the investment decisions in our early years. My careful budgeting and household management had allowed Stefan to focus on growing his practice. My networking at social events had brought him several high-value clients. Yet legally, practically, I had no claim to any of it without him. The credit cards were all in Stefan's name, with me listed as an authorized user. He could cancel my access with a simple phone call, and probably already had. I tried using the hotel's business center to log into my email, hoping to find some communication from Stefan, or perhaps access my old professional contacts. But I couldn't remember the password to my personal email account. Stefan had set up a password manager for our household accounts years ago, and I'd grown dependent on the convenience of never having to remember login credentials. Even my phone plan was part of Stefan's business account. If he decided to cancel my service, I'd lose my only connection to the outside world. Sitting in that business center, surrounded by the busy hum of guests checking emails and making travel arrangements, I realized how completely I'd surrendered my independence over the years. Every convenience Stefan had offered, managing our finances, handling our technology, taking care of the business side of our life, had been another thread in a web that now trapped me completely. I thought about calling my parents, but they'd both passed away within 2 years of each other, during my 4th year of marriage. Stefan had been wonderfully supportive during that difficult time, handling all the estate matters and legal paperwork while I grieved. Looking back now, I wondered if he'd deliberately taken control of those affairs to prevent me from gaining any independent financial resources from my inheritance. My few remaining college friends had drifted away over the years, a process Stefan had subtly encouraged by always finding reasons why we were too busy for social gatherings, or why certain friends were drama that we didn't need in our lives. He'd never forbidden me from maintaining those relationships. He was too smart for such obvious control, but he'd made it gradually more difficult and less rewarding to keep them alive. My professional network had atrophied during my years away from finance. The industry moved quickly, and 5 years out of the game might as well have been 50. Even if I could contact former colleagues, what would I tell them? That I needed help because my husband had abandoned me in Vegas after I'd spent years playing house instead of building a career? The checking account at the bank where I'd worked before marriage had been closed years ago, consolidated into Stefan's superior banking package with better rates and fewer fees. Smart financial management, he'd called it. Strategic simplification. As I sat there cataloging everything I'd lost, not just in the past 12 hours but gradually over 8 years of marriage, I felt something shift inside me. The panic and desperation were still there, but underneath them, something harder was crystallizing. Stefan had engineered this situation to prove my dependence on him. He'd stripped away my resources, my support systems, my very identity as anything other than his wife, and then abandoned me to demonstrate how helpless I was without him. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd left me in Las Vegas, a city built on calculated risks and the ability to spot opportunity in chaos. And despite 5 years of domestic servitude, I still remembered how to calculate odds. By 10 a.m., I'd made my first hard decision. The designer heels that had cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month had to go. I couldn't walk the Vegas streets looking for solutions while my feet were being tortured by Italian leather and 3-inch stilettos. In the hotel gift shop, I traded them to a fascinated clerk named Marcus for a pair of basic sneakers and $20 cash. Apparently, authentic Louboutin heels had decent resale value even in a tourist trap. Lady, you sure about this? Marcus had asked, examining the shoes with obvious appreciation. These are real expensive, right? They're not going to get me where I need to go, I'd replied, and meant it on multiple levels. The sneakers were ugly, bright white with gaudy silver accents and Las Vegas embroidered on the sides, but they fit, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I could walk without pain. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. I was adapting, making practical choices based on necessity rather than appearance. My next stop was the hotel's business center, where I spent $2 precious printing copies of my identification and the few important documents I had photos of on my phone. If I was going to survive in this city, I needed to start thinking like someone building a life from scratch, not someone waiting to be rescued. I used another $1 for a local newspaper, scanning the classified ads for any immediate opportunities. Room rentals, job listings, services needed, anything that might provide a foothold. Most required experience I didn't have, or wanted references I couldn't provide, but a few caught my attention. Several casinos were hiring for entry-level positions. A few restaurants needed servers. There were even some listings for what appeared to be legitimate temp agencies. But first, I needed to solve my most immediate problem: where to sleep tonight when my hotel keycard expired. I'd noticed something during my wandering around the Wynn. There was a constant flow of people in the lobby, some clearly guests, others who seemed to belong to some gray area between visitor and resident. Well-dressed individuals who spent hours in the lobby areas, nursing single drinks, making phone calls, conducting what appeared to be business meetings. I'd assumed they were high-roller guests with extended stays, but looking more carefully, I began to wonder if some of them were locals who'd learned to use the luxury hotels as unofficial offices. I approached a woman who'd been working on a laptop in the lobby bar for the past 3 hours, nursing the same coffee while taking calls and video conferences. She was probably in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested money but not ostentation, and she had the focused energy of someone running a business. "Excuse me," I said, settling into the chair across from her during a break between calls. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you a guest here?" She looked up from her laptop with sharp blue eyes, assessing me quickly. "Locals privilege," she said with a slight smile. "Best Wi-Fi in the city, comfortable seating, and as long as you're polite and buy something occasionally, they don't mind you setting up shop. You look like you're figuring out the same thing." Her directness was refreshing after Stefan's years of subtle manipulation. "I'm in a complicated situation," I admitted. "My husband left me here without resources, and I'm trying to figure out my next move." "Bastard," she said matter-of-factly, closing her laptop to give me her full attention. "I'm Evelyn Beck. I run a consulting business for small casinos, help them optimize their operations, improve their margins, figure out why they're hemorrhaging money in specific areas. What's your background?" "Bridget Seymour," I said, using my maiden name instinctively. "I used to be a financial analyst before I got married. Portfolio management, risk assessment, market trend analysis." Evelyn's eyebrows rose. "Used to be? How long ago?" 5 years, I admitted, expecting to see her interest fade. Instead, she leaned forward. "The financial crisis taught this city some hard lessons about risk management. Every casino owner I work with is paranoid about another crash, another bubble bursting. They want people who understand real financial analysis, not just gaming theory." She pulled a business card from her purse and slid it across the table. "I've got a project starting next week. Small casino downtown needs someone to audit their books and figure out why their profit margins are half what they should be. It's temporary work, maybe 2 weeks, but it pays decent and it's legitimate business experience." I stared at the card, hardly daring to hope. What kind of temporary? $1,500 for the full audit plus daily consulting fees if they want you to stick around and implement changes. Cash payment, no tax paperwork unless you want it. She studied my face. Of course you'd need somewhere to stay, somewhere to clean up and look professional. My heart sank. That's the problem. I literally have about $60 to my name. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. I might have a solution. My building has studio apartments, nothing fancy, but clean and safe. The owner's a friend who's always looking for reliable tenants. If I vouch for you and you can put down first week's rent in advance, she might work with you on the deposit. How much? $300 a week, utilities included. It's not the Ritz, but it's yours, and it's got everything you need to get back on your feet. I did the math quickly. It would take most of my remaining money just for the first week's rent, leaving me almost nothing for food or transportation. But it was a real opportunity, a chance to start earning legitimate money instead of just trying to survive day by day. Why would you help me? I asked. You don't even know me. Evelyn smiled grimly. Because 20 years ago, my husband cleaned out our joint accounts and disappeared with his secretary. Left me with 3 kids and a mortgage I couldn't pay. I know what it feels like to realize you have to rebuild everything from nothing. She stood up, gathering her laptop and papers. The difference is, it took me 2 years to figure out that I was stronger than I thought. You're figuring it out in 2 days. She handed me another card, this one for the apartment building. Call the number on the back and tell them Evelyn sent you. If you want the casino job, meet me here tomorrow at 8 a.m. and I'll take you to meet the owner. As she walked away, I stared at the 2 business cards in my hand. For the first time since Stefan had abandoned me, I felt something other than fear or desperation. I felt possibility. Standing in the Wynn's opulent lobby with Evelyn's business cards in my hand, I faced the first real choice I'd made in years. I could call my sister-in-law Charlotte back in Boston, swallow my pride, and beg her to wire me money for a plane ticket home. I could return to our Beacon Hill townhouse, wait for Stefan to come back from whatever extended tantrum this was supposed to be, and resume my role as the dutiful wife who'd learned her lesson about questioning his judgment. Or I could walk out of this hotel and into an uncertain future where I'd have to rebuild everything from scratch. I pulled out my phone and stared at Charlotte's number. Stefan's sister had always been cordial to me, though I'd sensed her disapproval of how completely I'd abandoned my career for marriage. She'd made several comments over the years about keeping your own money and maintaining independence, advice I'd dismissed as the bitterness of a twice-divorced woman who couldn't understand what Stefan and I had. Now her warnings seemed prophetic rather than bitter. I dialed her number, my thumb hovering over the call button. Charlotte would help me, she was fundamentally decent, and she'd be horrified by what Stefan had done. She'd wire me money, probably enough to fly home first class and hire a good divorce attorney. I'd be back in Boston by tomorrow evening, sleeping in my own bed, plotting my revenge against Stefan through proper legal channels. The safe choice. The predictable choice. The choice that would return me to a life where I was defined by my relationship to Stefan Gilbert, whether as his wife or his ex-wife. Instead, I found myself scrolling through my contacts until I reached Stefan's name. My finger hovered over the delete button, and I realized this moment represented more than just removing a phone number. It was choosing who I wanted to be going forward. I pressed delete. Rick's number followed, then Stefan's office line, his assistant's direct number, the law firm's main line. One by one, I erased every connection to the life I'd built around Stefan Gilbert's ambitions and expectations. With each deleted contact, I felt something inside me shifting, solidifying. By the time I'd finished, my contacts list looked sparse and foreign. But for the first time in years, every number that remained belonged to someone who knew me as Bridget Seymour, not just as Stefan's wife. I walked out of the Wynn into the blazing Nevada sun, my cheap tourist sneakers hitting the sidewalk with a satisfying thud. The Strip stretched out before me in both directions, a gaudy, chaotic testament to the possibility of reinvention. In this city, people transformed themselves daily. Small-town accountants became high-roller gamblers. Failed businessmen became lounge entertainers. Desperate housewives became, well, I was about to find out. The address on Evelyn's card led me to a neighborhood 20 minutes off the Strip, where the glamour gave way to practical apartment complexes and local businesses that served actual residents rather than tourists. The Desert Palms apartments looked exactly like what they were: basic housing for working people who couldn't afford to live in the fantasy version of Las Vegas that tourists paid premium prices to experience. The building manager, a woman named Carmen with silver-streaked hair and suspicious eyes, met me in the small office that smelled of coffee and cigarettes. She looked me up and down, taking in my wrinkled designer dress and tourist sneakers with obvious skepticism. "Evelyn says you need a place," Carmen said without preamble. "She also says you're good for the money, but you look like someone who's running from something." "I am," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. "I'm running from a marriage that turned me into someone I don't recognize. I'm running from a life where I forgot I was capable of taking care of myself." Carmen's expression softened slightly. "Honey, half the women in this city are running from something. Question is, are you running towards something better? Or are you just running?" I thought about Evelyn's offer, about the possibility of using skills I'd buried for 5 years, about the chance to prove to myself that the woman who'd once analyzed complex financial portfolios hadn't disappeared entirely. "I'm running towards something better," I said. "I just need a place to start." Carmen pulled out a standard rental agreement and a key attached to a plastic tag marked 14B. "First week in advance," like Evelyn said, $300 cash. "You cause any trouble, you're gone the same day. You pay late twice, you're gone. You bring drama from whatever you're running from to my building, you're gone." I counted out $300 from my remaining cash, leaving me with $18 and change. It should have felt terrifying, giving up almost everything I had for a studio apartment I hadn't even seen. Instead, it felt like the most empowering financial decision I'd made in years. "One more thing," Carmen said as she handed me the key. "Evelyn mentioned you might need some basic supplies to get started. There's a grocery store 2 blocks east, a thrift shop 3 blocks west. Both within walking distance, both understand people starting over." She paused, studying my face. "You got that look," she said finally. "What look?" "The look of someone who just realized they're tougher than they thought they were." She smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. "Good, you're gonna need that." As I walked up the concrete stairs to apartment 14B, I felt the weight of the key in my palm. It was cheap metal, probably copied dozens of times, nothing like the smart locks and security systems of our Beacon Hill home. But it was mine. Apartment 14B was approximately the size of Stefan's walk-in closet. The entire space couldn't have been more than 400 square feet, containing a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and apartment-sized refrigerator, and a bathroom so small I had to step into the shower to close the door. The single window looked out onto the parking lot, where a collection of aging cars and pickup trucks baked in the desert heat. It was perfect. For the first time in 8 years, I stood in a space that was entirely mine. No carefully coordinated color schemes that Stefan had approved. No furniture chosen to impress his colleagues. No artifacts of a life designed around someone else's vision of success. Just basic functionality and honest simplicity. I pulled down the Murphy bed and sat on its thin mattress, taking inventory of my situation with the same methodical approach I'd once used to analyze investment portfolios. Assets: $18 cash, a cell phone with 40% battery, the clothes on my back, and a roof over my head for 7 days. Liabilities: no job, no references, no professional wardrobe, and no safety net. But for the first time since Stefan had abandoned me, I wasn't focused on what I'd lost. I was calculating what I could build. My first priority was extending my money until I could start earning. The thrift shop Carmen had mentioned yielded a small treasure trove: 2 professional blouses for $8, a pair of black pants that fit reasonably well for $5, and a blazer that had seen better days but would pass for business attire from a distance for $3. The elderly volunteer at the checkout counter threw in a canvas tote bag for free, when I mentioned I was starting a new job. "Fresh start?" she asked, with the knowing smile of someone who'd seen plenty of people rebuilding their lives. "Something like that," I replied, and realized I was smiling too. The grocery store was an education in survival economics. $18 had to cover food for potentially several days, so luxury was out of the question. Rice, dried beans, canned vegetables, eggs, bread, peanut butter, foods that would keep me fed and functional until Evelyn's consulting job materialized. I splurged on a bag of coffee, telling myself it was a business necessity if I was going to be working with numbers again. Back in my studio, I hand-washed my new clothes in the bathroom sink, hung them to dry on the shower rod, and used the apartment's basic Wi-Fi to access the public library's databases. If I was going to audit a casino's financial operations, I needed to refresh myself on industry standards and current regulatory requirements. The work felt like coming home. For 5 years, I'd channeled my analytical mind into optimizing grocery lists and social calendars. Now, as I dove back into financial statements and profit margin calculations, I remembered why I'd loved this work. The satisfaction of finding patterns in numbers, of identifying inefficiencies and opportunities that others had missed. I spent the evening reviewing everything I could find about casino operations, from gaming revenue streams to overhead management. The industry had evolved significantly during my years away from finance, with new technologies and regulatory changes that I needed to understand. But the fundamental principles remained the same: money in, money out, and the critical importance of understanding where every dollar went. As I worked by the apartment's single lamp, subsisting on instant coffee and peanut butter sandwiches, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: intellectual challenge. Stefan had gradually trained me to defer to his expertise on everything from investment decisions to restaurant choices, claiming it was more efficient than debating every decision. I'd told myself I was being a supportive wife, but really, I'd been slowly suffocating my own judgment and curiosity. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Bridget, it's Evelyn. Meet me at the Desert Rose Casino tomorrow at 9 a.m. It's downtown, about 15 minutes by bus from your place. Dress professional but not flashy. Owner's old school Vegas. Doesn't trust anyone who looks too polished. Looking forward to seeing what you can do." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you for the opportunity. I won't let you down." But as I prepared for bed, folding the Murphy bed down from the wall and laying out my thrift store professional outfit for tomorrow, I realized the most important thing wasn't whether I'd let Evelyn down. It was whether I'd finally stop letting myself down. I'd spent 5 years making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient for Stefan's vision of our life together. I'd convinced myself that managing his world was a valid use of my skills, that supporting his success was the same as achieving my own success. Now, lying in a Murphy bed in a studio apartment with 18 cents left to my name, I felt more successful than I had in years. Because for the first time since my wedding day, every choice I was making was mine. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that casino as Bridget Seymour, financial analyst. Not as Stefan Gilbert's wife, not as someone's accessory or support system, but as a professional with skills and expertise that someone needed. I'd forgotten how that felt. I'd forgotten who that woman was. But she was still here, and she was ready to get back to work. The last thing I did before falling asleep was delete my married name from my phone's contact information, changing it back to Bridget Seymour. It was a small gesture, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd thought was lost forever. Stefan had abandoned me to teach me about dependence. Instead, he'd accidentally reminded me about independence. Tomorrow, I'd start proving that to both of us. The Desert Rose Casino looked like it had been forgotten by time and progress. Squeezed between a pawn shop and a bail bonds office on a street that tourists never saw, it bore no resemblance to the glittering palaces of the Strip. The carpet was faded, the slot machines were older models that still took coins, and the few patrons scattered around at 9 a.m. looked like they'd been there all night. Bart Gret, the owner, was exactly what Evelyn had described: Old school Vegas with suspicious eyes and a handshake that felt like a test of character. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a shirt that had been expensive decades ago and a watch that had seen better years. "Evelyn says you can find money I'm losing," he said without preamble, leading me to a cramped office behind the main gaming floor. "Says you used to work for some fancy firm back east before you got married and forgot how to count." The casual dismissal of my life choices stung, but I kept my expression neutral. I specialized in identifying revenue leaks and optimizing profit margins. "Evelyn thought my background might be useful for your situation." "My situation," Bart repeated with a bitter laugh, "is that this place should be printing money, but somehow I'm barely breaking even. Been running casinos for 40 years, never seen anything like it." He dumped a stack of ledgers and financial statements on the desk in front of me. "Everything's there. Revenue reports, expense accounts, employee records, vendor contracts. Figure out where my money's going, and I'll pay you what Evelyn promised." I spent the first hour just trying to understand their record-keeping system, which appeared to be a combination of handwritten ledgers, basic spreadsheets, and receipts stuffed into manila envelopes. It was a forensic accountant's nightmare, but gradually, patterns began to emerge. By lunch, I'd identified the first problem. Their food service vendor was charging premium prices for below-average products, and the delivery records showed consistent overcharges that no one had been tracking. It was a relatively small issue, but it represented thousands of dollars in unnecessary expenses over the past year. "Found something already," Bart said when I showed him my preliminary findings. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked impressed. But as I dug deeper into the records, a more troubling picture emerged. The revenue numbers didn't add up in ways that went beyond simple bookkeeping errors or vendor overcharges. Money was disappearing from multiple revenue streams: gaming receipts, food sales, even the parking fees were lower than they should have been given the documented customer traffic. By the third day, I was certain that someone was stealing from Bart's casino, and they were doing it systematically across multiple departments. The thefts were sophisticated, spread out over time and various revenue sources to avoid detection. This wasn't opportunistic pilfering, this was organized embezzlement. The problem was proving it, and more importantly, identifying who was responsible. I spent my evenings in apartment 14B surrounded by spreadsheets and receipts, surviving on rice and canned vegetables while trying to trace the missing money. My cheap thrift store clothes were starting to show wear, and I developed a persistent cough from the air conditioning in the casino. But I was close to solving the puzzle, and the intellectual challenge was intoxicating. That's when everything fell apart. On Friday afternoon, as I was preparing to present my findings to Bart, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Charlotte's number, Stefan's sister, whom I hadn't spoken to since the wedding of their cousin 2 years ago. "Bridget, thank God." Charlotte's voice was tight with anxiety. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Stefan's been calling everyone, saying you've had some kind of breakdown and disappeared. He's worried sick." My blood went cold. "Stefan called you?" "He said you had a fight in Vegas and you ran off. He's been looking for you everywhere, honey. He filed a missing persons report with the Boston police. He thinks you might be having some kind of mental health crisis." The room started spinning around me. Stefan wasn't just abandoning me. He was controlling the narrative, making himself the concerned husband dealing with an unstable wife. By the time I returned to Boston, if I ever did, everyone in our social circle would believe I'd had a breakdown rather than been betrayed. "Charlotte, that's not what happened," I started, but she cut me off. "I know you two have been having problems. Stefan told me about the fertility issues, about how you've been struggling with depression since the last miscarriage." I nearly dropped the phone. "What miscarriage?" "Charlotte, I've never been pregnant." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Bridget," Stefan said, "he said you lost a baby 6 months ago and you've been unstable ever since. That's why he took you to Vegas, to try to help you feel better." The lies were so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that I realized Stefan had been planning this character assassination for months, maybe years. He'd created a fictional version of our marriage, where I was the troubled wife, whose mental health issues explained any behavior that didn't fit his narrative. "None of that is true," I whispered, but even as I said it, I could hear how desperate I sounded, how exactly like someone having a breakdown might sound. "Honey, maybe you should come home," Charlotte said gently. "Stefan's arranged for you to see Dr. Morrison. You remember him from the country club? He specializes in helping women through difficult transitions." Dr. Morrison, who played golf with Stefan every Thursday and whose wife attended the same charity luncheons I used to organize, who would undoubtedly confirm whatever diagnosis Stefan suggested, especially if it helped his golfing partner's legal case. After I hung up, I sat in Bart's office, staring at the financial records that had become my lifeline back to professional competence. I'd found the embezzlement, identified the theft patterns, even narrowed down the list of suspects to 3 employees who had access to multiple revenue streams. But it didn't matter. Stefan had made sure that anything I accomplished here would be dismissed as the delusions of a woman who'd suffered a mental breakdown and run away from her concerned husband. I could return to Boston and try to fight his version of events, but who would believe me? I had no allies in our social circle, no independent financial resources, and no evidence of what had really happened in that casino. Meanwhile, Stefan had months of groundwork laying the foundation for his story about my declining mental health. Or I could stay in Vegas, finish the job I'd started, and prove to myself that I was still capable of professional success, even if no one back home would ever know about it. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples visible through Bart's grimy office window, I made my choice. I wasn't going back to Boston to fight Stefan's lies. I was going to build something here that was so successful, so undeniably real, that his fiction couldn't touch it. I must have looked as shattered as I felt when Bart walked into his office Monday morning and found me surrounded by 3 days' worth of financial records, empty coffee cups, and the crumpled remains of my professional composure. I'd spent the weekend spiraling between rage at Stefan's manipulation and terror at how completely he'd isolated me. But I'd also finished tracing every dollar of the missing money. "Jesus, Seymour, you look like hell," Bart said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen better decades. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't made of caffeine?" I tried to answer, but my voice cracked. The combination of exhaustion, stress, and the growing realization that Stefan had been planning my destruction for months finally broke through the professional facade I'd been maintaining. To my horror, I started crying in front of my client. "Hey now," Bart said, his gruff voice gentling unexpectedly. "Whatever it is, it can't be worse than what happened to my last accountant. And he got arrested for embezzling from 3 different clients, so that's setting the bar pretty high for disaster." Through my tears, I managed a weak laugh. "Your current accountant might be having a nervous breakdown, so you might want to reconsider that comparison." Bart leaned back in his chair, studying me with eyes that had seen decades of human behavior in all its forms. "You want to tell me what's really going on here? And don't give me any bullshit about being fine. I've been running this place since before you were born. I know what people look like when their world's falling apart." So I told him everything. Stefan's abandonment in the casino, the stolen credit cards, the phone calls to Charlotte, the elaborate lies about miscarriages and mental breakdowns that painted me as an unstable wife rather than a betrayed one. I told him about the 5 years of gradually surrendering my independence, about waking up in Vegas to realize I'd been living someone else's life. Bart listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of disgust when I described Stefan's more calculating moves. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your husband sounds like a real piece of work," he said finally. "Reminds me of my second wife's lawyer during our divorce. Same kind of guy who could make you sound crazy for objecting to getting screwed over." He stood up and walked to a small refrigerator in the corner of his office, pulling out 2 bottles of water and a sandwich wrapped in deli paper. "Eat this," he commanded, sliding the sandwich across the desk. Can't have my financial analyst passing out from malnutrition before she finishes catching my thief. Bart, eat the sandwich, Seymour. Then tell me what you found in my books. Because judging by the state of this office, you've been working on something big. The sandwich was simple, turkey and Swiss on rye, but it was the first real food I'd had in days. As I ate, I spread out my findings, walking Bart through the pattern of thefts I'd discovered. Someone's been skimming from multiple revenue streams, I explained, pointing to highlighted sections of the ledgers. Gaming receipts, food service, even the parking meters. They're taking small amounts from each source to avoid triggering any single department's attention, but over the past 18 months, they've stolen approximately $127,000. Bart's face darkened as the scope of the theft became clear. $127,000? That's why I can't keep the lights on while places half this size are turning profit. It gets worse, I continued. The theft pattern suggests someone with administrative access to multiple systems. Someone who can modify records across departments and has been doing this long enough to know your business cycles. I handed him a single sheet of paper with 3 names on it. Based on access patterns and the timing of discrepancies, it's one of these 3 employees. Bart stared at the list, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to heartbreak. All 3 names belonged to people who'd worked for him for years, employees he'd trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. Edie Hansen, he read aloud. Been my floor manager for 8 years. Single mom, put her kid through college on what I pay her. He moved to the second name. Christian Beck, my head of security. Former cop, been here 6 years. Finally, Rick Seymour, my assistant manager. Been here. He stopped abruptly, looking up at me with sharp eyes. Seymour, that's your name too. Maiden name, I clarified. No relation to your employee, as far as I know. But Bart, there's something else you need to know about the thefts. I pulled out a separate file, this one containing the most damning evidence I'd found. Whoever's doing this isn't just stealing cash, they're also manipulating your tax reports, understating revenue to reduce your tax liability. If the IRS discovers this during an audit, you could face serious criminal charges for tax evasion, even though you had no knowledge of it. The color drained from Bart's face. How serious? Potentially felony charges. Substantial fines. They could shut you down and seize the property. I met his eyes. Whoever's doing this isn't just stealing your money, they're setting you up to take the fall for their crimes. Bart was quiet for several minutes, staring at the evidence of betrayal by someone he'd trusted. Finally, he looked up at me with something approaching respect. You saved my life, he said simply. If you hadn't found this, I'd probably be in federal prison within a year while my thief walked away clean. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. Here's what I owe you for the audit, plus a bonus for saving my ass from the feds. But I want to make you another offer. Inside the envelope was $2,500 in cash, more money than I'd seen since Stefan had abandoned me. I need someone I can trust to help me clean up this mess and rebuild my operations, Bart continued. Someone who understands both the numbers and how people try to manipulate them. Interested in sticking around Vegas for a while? For the first time since Charlotte's phone call had shattered my confidence, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. What kind of position are you talking about? Bart smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. How does Chief Financial Officer sound? Because after what you just showed me, I think I finally found someone who's tougher than the bastards trying to steal from me. The first thing I learned about running a casino's finances was that everything I thought I knew about business was wrong. In my previous life analyzing portfolios for investment firms, success was measured in percentage points and quarterly projections. At the Desert Rose, success was measured in whether you could keep the lights on while 3 different regulatory agencies breathed down your neck and half your employees tried to steal from you. Bart's offer of Chief Financial Officer came with a modest office next to his, a salary that seemed impossible given what I'd seen of the casino's struggling finances, and the immediate responsibility of implementing the security measures needed to prevent future theft. My first week in the position, I discovered that our embezzler was Christian Beck, the head of security who'd been using his access to modify surveillance records and cover his theft from multiple departments. "Son of a bitch had me convinced we had a customer service problem," Bart muttered as we watched Christian being escorted out in handcuffs. "Kept telling me we needed to comp more drinks and meals to keep people happy, all while he was pocketing the money we should have been making from those same customers." The recovery process was like performing surgery on a patient who was bleeding out. Every system Christian had touched needed to be rebuilt from scratch. New point-of-sale software for the gaming floor, updated inventory tracking for the restaurant and bar, a complete overhaul of the employee scheduling system that he'd been manipulating to hide his presence during theft periods. But with each system we rebuilt, I felt myself growing stronger and more confident. The analytical skills I'd abandoned during my marriage weren't just intact, they were sharper than ever, honed by years of managing complex household logistics and social schedules. I'd learned to track details and anticipate problems, skills that translated perfectly to identifying vulnerabilities in casino operations. Within a month, our profit margins had improved by 18%. By the second month, we were showing consistent weekly profits for the first time in 2 years. Local regulatory inspectors, who'd been treating the Desert Rose like a problem property, started commenting on our improved compliance and record-keeping. "Never seen a turnaround this fast," Bart admitted one evening as we reviewed monthly reports. "Place was hemorrhaging money for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to actually make a profit." The work was demanding in ways I'd never experienced. 12-hour days were standard, and I spent weekends learning about gaming regulations, tax compliance, and the dozens of licenses required to operate even a small casino. But for the first time since college, I was building expertise that was entirely mine. No one was explaining my success as support for someone else's career or minimizing my contributions as helpful assistance. The staff, initially suspicious of the new CFO who'd exposed their popular security chief as a thief, gradually began to respect my competence. Edie Hansen, the floor manager who'd been one of my initial suspects, became an unexpected ally when she realized my systems were designed to protect honest employees rather than spy on them. "You know what I like about working for you?" she said one afternoon as we reviewed staffing schedules. "You explain why we're doing things instead of just demanding compliance." Christian used to bark orders and act like questioning anything was insubordination. "Questions help me identify problems before they become crises," I replied. "And you know this business better than I do in a lot of ways. I'd be stupid not to listen to your insights." It was a management philosophy born from years of being dismissed and ignored by Stefan. I'd learned firsthand how demoralizing it was to have your expertise discounted, and I was determined never to make my employees feel the way Stefan had made me feel. My personal life was Spartan but satisfying. The studio apartment had become a comfortable base, and I'd gradually acquired basic furniture from thrift stores and garage sales. Nothing matched, but everything was chosen by me for practical reasons, rather than to impress anyone. I cooked simple meals, read industry publications, and fell asleep most nights with spreadsheets still scattered across my small table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that used my talents and made a real difference to people who depended on the casino for their livelihoods. When Bart started talking about expanding to a second location, possibly bringing me in as a partner rather than just an employee, I realized I was building something substantial rather than just surviving. The loneliness was harder to manage. Vegas was full of people, but most were either tourists passing through or locals focused on their own struggles. I developed casual friendships with coworkers and neighbors, but no one who knew the full story of how I'd ended up rebuilding my life in a downtown casino. Sometimes, lying in my Murphy bed and listening to the city noise outside my window, I'd wonder what Stefan was doing. Whether he'd maintained his fiction about my mental breakdown, or eventually admitted the truth to someone. Whether he missed having a personal assistant disguised as a wife, or if he'd already found someone new to manage his domestic operations. But those moments of curiosity grew shorter and less frequent as my new life gained momentum. I was becoming someone Stefan had never known. A woman with independent professional success, financial autonomy, and the daily satisfaction of solving real problems with measurable results. 3 months after accepting Bart's offer, I received my first business card with Bridget Seymour, Chief Financial Officer, printed in simple black letters. It was the first time in 8 years that my identity hadn't been defined by my relationship to someone else. I kept that card in my wallet, not for professional networking, but as a reminder of who I was becoming. Someone Stefan Gilbert had never met, and never would. Cain. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, handwritten on casino letterhead in Bart's careful script: Desert Rose Casino Annual Employee Appreciation Dinner. Saturday, 7 p.m. Golden Nugget Private Dining Room. Bring a guest if you have one, come alone if you don't. Either way, you're family now. Family. The word hit me harder than it should have. In Boston, Stefan and I had attended dozens of corporate events, but I'd always been an accessory to his networking, someone who made appropriate conversation and remembered clients' wives' names. Here I was being invited for my own contributions, my own place in the community Bart had built around his struggling casino. The employee dinner turned out to be nothing like the sterile corporate events I remembered from my married life. 23 employees gathered around tables that Bart had insisted on paying for despite our still tight margins, sharing stories and laughter that came from genuine affection rather than professional obligation. Speech, someone called when Bart stood up with his coffee cup, and the entire room joined in the demand. He raised his hands for quiet, his weathered face unusually serious. "You all know this place nearly went under this year," he began. "What you might not know is how close we came to losing everything." He gestured toward me. "Our CFO here didn't just find the money that was bleeding out, she saved us from federal charges that would have shut us down permanently." The applause was warm and sustained, but what struck me most was how naturally he'd called me our CFO. Not the new CFO, or Bridget from back east, but someone who belonged here, whose success was intertwined with everyone else's livelihood. Edie Hansen, the floor manager who'd become my closest work friend, stood up with her own coffee cup. "I want to add something," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I've worked for a lot of managers over the years, and most of them treated us like we were trying to steal from them, or too stupid to understand the business. Bridget's the first boss who's ever asked for my opinion and actually listened to the answer." More nods around the room. Carmen Rodriguez from housekeeping added, "She fixed the scheduling software so we can actually request time off without having to beg 3 different supervisors. And she got us that new coffee machine in the break room," called out Danny from maintenance, earning laughs. "Real coffee, not that brown water we used to get from the vending machine." The recognition continued around the table, each employee mentioning small improvements I'd implemented. Not dramatic changes, but practical fixes that made their work lives better. Flexible scheduling for the single parents. Updated safety equipment that actually fit properly. A suggestion box that wasn't just for show. With monthly meetings where we discussed employee recommendations. I'd been trying to create the kind of workplace I'd wished for during the years when Stefan had treated me like an employee in my own marriage. Someone whose expertise was valued, whose input mattered, who was seen as capable of growth and increased responsibility. "There's something else," Bart said when the individual testimonials wound down. "I've been talking with some investors about opening a second location. Nothing fancy, but a bigger place with more gaming tables and proper restaurant service." He paused, looking directly at me. "I've proposed making Bridget a full partner in the expansion. 25% ownership, full authority over financial operations, and a seat on the board of directors." The room erupted in applause and congratulations, but I could barely hear them over the pounding of my heart. A partnership, ownership, the kind of business opportunity that Stefan had always claimed was beyond my capabilities, because I, quote, didn't have the risk tolerance for real entrepreneurship. After dinner, as the group moved to the casino floor for informal gambling with play money Bart had provided, Edie pulled me aside. "You know what I noticed about you when you first started?" she said, settling onto a stool at the bar. "You apologized for everything. Asked permission to change things that were obviously broken, acted like you expected someone to tell you that you weren't qualified. I thought back to those first weeks, when I drafted every memo 3 times and double-checked every decision with Bart before implementing it. I guess I wasn't used to being trusted with important decisions. Well, you've figured it out now, Edie said with a grin. Last week, when that gaming commission inspector tried to intimidate you about the new reporting procedures, you didn't back down an inch. Just explained our compliance protocols like you were teaching a class and made him look like an amateur. She was right. Somewhere over the past few months, I'd stopped seeking permission for every choice and started taking ownership of my decisions. When problems arose, I solved them. When opportunities appeared, I pursued them. When challenges emerged, I faced them with confidence in my own competence. Can I ask you something personal? Edie continued. That husband who abandoned you here, did he ever tell you that you were good at anything important? The question caught me off guard. I tried to remember Stefan complimenting my professional abilities, acknowledging my contributions to our financial success, praising my problem-solving skills. But every positive comment I could recall was about my appearance, my social skills, my ability to support his career goals. No, I said finally. I don't think he ever did. Well, we're telling you now, Edie said, raising her beer in a mock toast. You're good at important things. You're good at fixing problems, managing people, building something that lasts. And you're good at treating people like they matter. As the evening wound down and employees gradually drifted home to their families, I found myself standing outside the Golden Nugget looking up at the neon skyline of downtown Las Vegas. 6 months ago, I'd been abandoned in this city with nothing but the clothes on my back and $43 in cash. Now I had a career I'd built with my own skills, colleagues who respected my competence, and the offer of genuine partnership in a growing business. I had an apartment that was small but mine, savings account that grew every month, and the daily satisfaction of work that made a real difference. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that the woman Stefan had tried to diminish was still here, stronger and more capable than he'd ever allowed her to be. Tomorrow, I'd give Bart my answer about the partnership offer, but tonight I already knew what that answer would be. The partnership papers were spread across Bart's desk like a roadmap to a future I'd never imagined possible. 25% ownership of Desert Rose Enterprises, with expansion rights for 3 additional locations across Nevada. My signature would make me a legitimate business owner, with assets, equity, and the kind of financial independence that Stefan had convinced me I was incapable of achieving. Take your time reading through it, Bart said, settling back in his chair with the patience of someone who'd made enough deals to know that the important ones required careful consideration. My lawyer says everything's standard, but you should probably have your own attorney review it before you sign. My own attorney. 6 months ago, I couldn't have afforded a consultation with a paralegal. Now I had the resources to hire independent legal counsel for a business partnership that would make me a millionaire within 5 years if our projections were accurate. I had spent the weekend reviewing the financial projections for the expansion, cross-referencing them with industry benchmarks and regional market analysis. The numbers were solid, better than solid actually. Vegas was experiencing a resurgence in off-strip gambling, as tourists looked for more authentic experiences, and locals wanted neighborhood casinos where they could feel like regulars rather than marks. Our proposed second location was in a perfect spot, close enough to the Strip to attract tourists who wanted a break from the mega casinos, but embedded in a residential area that would provide steady local business. The building had been a restaurant that failed during the economic downturn, and the owners were motivated to make a deal that would put reliable tenants in place. I have some concerns about the staffing projections, I said, pointing to a section of the business plan. We're assuming we can hire experienced dealers and floor staff at competitive wages, but the Strip casinos are pulling a lot of talent, with signing bonuses and benefits packages we can't match. Bart nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that convinced me you should be my partner instead of just my employee. What do you suggest? I pulled out my own folder, containing the alternative staffing plan I'd developed over the weekend. We recruit from the community colleges and provide our own training program. Higher initial investment in education, but we end up with employees who are loyal to us rather than job hopping for better offers. We also implement profit sharing from day one, so every employee has a financial stake in our success. Profit sharing cuts into our margins, Bart pointed out, but his tone was curious rather than dismissive. Short term, yes. Long term, it reduces turnover, improves customer service, and creates a culture where employees actively look for ways to increase revenue, rather than just showing up for their shifts. I showed him my calculations. Based on industry turnover rates, we'll save more in recruiting and training costs than we lose in profit sharing within 18 months. Bart studied my projections for several minutes, occasionally making notes in the margins. Finally, he looked up with the expression I'd learned to recognize when he was genuinely impressed. "You've been thinking about this partnership as more than just an opportunity for yourself," he said. "You're thinking about building something sustainable." I learned the hard way what happens when you don't have control over your own financial security, I replied. I want to build a business that provides that same security for our employees, not just our investors. That afternoon, Bart introduced me to Marcus Chen, the investor group's lead representative. Marcus was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from successfully managing other people's money for years. "Bart's told me about your turnaround of the Desert Rose," Marcus said as we reviewed the expansion proposal. 18% profit improvement in 4 months is impressive, especially given the challenges you were working with. "The Desert Rose had good bones," I replied. "It just needed better systems and people who were motivated to succeed rather than steal." Marcus smiled. "Modest and accurate, I like that. Too many people in this business oversell their contributions." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "I want to discuss something that Bart might not have mentioned. Our group is interested in more than just this expansion. If the second location performs as projected, we're looking at a potential network of community casinos across the Southwest. The kind of operation that could go public within 10 years. The implications hit me immediately. This wasn't just about owning a small business. This was about building a casino empire. The kind of success that would put me in boardrooms with major investors, financial publications, industry conferences, where I'd be recognized as an expert rather than someone's supportive spouse. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the excitement building in my chest. "Aggressive, but realistic. Second location opening within 8 months. Third and fourth locations within 2 years. By year 5, we're looking at 15 to 20 properties across Nevada, Arizona, and possibly New Mexico." Marcus pulled out a tablet, showing me a map with potential locations marked. Conservative projections put the total network value at $200 million by year 7. I stared at the map, calculating my potential ownership stake in an operation that size. Even at 25% of the growth phase, I'd be looking at generational wealth. The kind of financial independence that would make Stefan's lawyer salary look like pocket change. Of course, this would require significant time commitment from both partners, Marcus continued. We're talking about someone who's willing to dedicate the next decade to building something major, rather than just running a comfortable local business. I thought about the studio apartment that had become my sanctuary, the simple life I'd built around honest work and genuine relationships. Then I thought about the woman who'd stood in that casino 6 months ago with nothing but $43. And the determination to prove she was stronger than the man who'd abandoned her. "When do we start?" I said. The business card felt different now, heavier, more substantial. Bridget Seymour, Chief Executive Officer, Desert Rose Enterprises. Embossed in gold lettering on premium card stock. I'd had them printed the day after signing the partnership agreement that made me the operational head of what Marcus Chen's investment group was already calling the fastest-growing regional casino network in the Southwest. 6 months as a partner had transformed not just my bank account, but my entire sense of what was possible. The second Desert Rose location had opened 2 months ahead of schedule and 15% under budget, thanks to the employee training programs and cost management systems I'd developed. Industry publications were featuring our quote business model, and I'd been invited to speak at 3 different gaming conferences about sustainable growth in the casino sector. The woman looking back at me from the mirror in my new downtown office bore little resemblance to the abandoned wife who'd pawned her wedding ring in a hotel gift shop. My hair was shorter now, cut in a professional style that required no one's approval but my own. I'd traded the designer dresses that Stefan had preferred for tailored pantsuits that commanded respect in boardrooms full of men who'd initially assumed I was someone's assistant. My apartment had evolved too. Still modest by Stefan's standards, but it was a genuine one-bedroom now, with a kitchen where I could cook real meals, and a home office where I worked on expansion plans that would make me legitimately wealthy within 5 years. The furniture was nice but practical, chosen for comfort and functionality rather than to impress visitors who never came. Because the truth was, I hadn't dated anyone since Stefan. Hadn't even been tempted, despite the occasional interest from business associates or the persistent flirtation from Danny Rodriguez, the architect who designed our second location. I was too busy building something that belonged entirely to me, too focused on proving that the woman Stefan had dismissed as dependent was capable of creating an empire he could never have imagined. The breakthrough moment had come 3 months earlier, when a major gaming corporation had approached us about acquiring our network for $50 million. Marcus had been ready to take the deal. It represented a 400% return on the investor's initial capital in less than 2 years. But I'd convinced him to decline. "We're not building something to sell," I'd argued during the tense partner meeting where our entire future was debated. "We're building something that creates ongoing value for everyone involved. Investors, employees, communities. This offer represents what we've already accomplished, not what we're capable of achieving." The decision to refuse had been vindicated within weeks, when our 3rd location opened to record first-month revenue and our employee retention rates became the industry standard for excellence. We weren't just running successful casinos, we were creating a new model for how gaming companies could operate as genuine community partners, rather than extractive businesses. That's when the email arrived that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my office door. Sarah was efficient and professional, nothing like the flustered young women who'd worked for Stefan, who'd always seemed intimidated by their boss's wife. "There's a call for you," Sarah said, her expression carefully neutral. "Someone named Charlotte Gilbert from Boston. She says she's your sister-in-law and it's urgent." My blood went cold. Charlotte hadn't called since that devastating conversation 8 months ago, when she'd repeated Stefan's lies about my mental breakdown and fictional miscarriages. I'd assumed she'd written me off as the unstable ex-wife who'd abandoned her responsibilities and disappeared into delusion. "Put her through," I said, straightening in my chair as I prepared for whatever news had prompted this contact. "Bridget?" Charlotte's voice was strained, uncertain. "Thank God you answered. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to talk to me after everything that happened." "What's wrong, Charlotte?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Professional. "It's Stefan," she said, and I could hear her struggling with whatever she needed to tell me. "He's been arrested. Federal charges, embezzlement, tax evasion, fraud. The FBI raided his office yesterday morning and froze all his accounts." I set down my pen carefully, my mind immediately shifting into analytical mode. "What kind of embezzlement?" "Client funds. Apparently he's been stealing from his firm's escrow accounts for years, using new client deposits to cover previous thefts. The whole thing collapsed when a major client tried to withdraw their retainer." Charlotte's voice was shaking. "Bridget, he's been lying about everything. The house, the investments, our family finances. It was all stolen money." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Stefan, who had abandoned me to teach me about dependence, had been secretly dependent on theft to maintain the lifestyle he'd used to control me. The successful attorney who'd dismissed my professional capabilities had been running a Ponzi scheme that any competent financial analyst would have spotted immediately. "There's something else," Charlotte continued. "The investigators want to talk to you. They think you might have information about his financial activities during your marriage." I looked around my office, the awards on the wall, the expansion plans spread across my desk, the view of downtown Las Vegas where I'd built something real and sustainable through honest work and genuine expertise. "Tell them I'll be happy to cooperate," I said. "I'll be in Boston next week anyway." "You will?" "I'm speaking at a conference at Harvard Business School," I explained, enjoying the surprise in her voice, "about innovative approaches to regional business development. But I can meet with the investigators while I'm there." The silence on Charlotte's end stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Bridget," she finally said, her voice small, "I owe you an apology. Stefan told us you'd had a breakdown, that you'd become unstable after losing a baby. But there was never a baby, was there?" "No, Charlotte, there wasn't." "Jesus, he's been lying to everyone for so long, I don't even know what's true anymore." I thought about the woman Stefan had described to his family: fragile, dependent, unable to cope with reality. Then I looked at the quarterly reports, showing record profits from the business I had built from nothing. "The truth is," I said, "Stefan did me the biggest favor of my life when he abandoned me in Vegas. He just didn't realize it at the time." I was reviewing architectural plans for our 5th location when Sarah knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before: part confusion, part concern, and something that looked like barely suppressed amusement. "There are 2 men here to see you," she said carefully. "They don't have an appointment, but they're insisting it's urgent. One of them claims to be your husband." My pen stopped moving across the blueprints. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the distant hum of slot machines from the casino floor below. Stefan. After 10 months of silence, he'd tracked me down just as I was about to sign the contracts that would make me the majority owner of a $100 million casino network. "My ex-husband," I corrected, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "And who's with him?" "His brother, apparently. Rick something, they both look." Sarah paused, searching for the right word. "Desperate might be accurate." I thought about the federal embezzlement charges, the frozen assets, the collapse of everything Stefan had built on stolen money. Of course he was desperate. And of course, he'd brought Rick with him, the same brother who'd laughed as they drove away from that casino nearly a year ago, leaving me stranded with $43, and the assumption that I'd come crawling back within days. "Give me 5 minutes to finish this section, then send them in," I said, returning my attention to the architectural plans. "And Sarah, stay close to your desk. I suspect this conversation won't last long." The 5 minutes weren't about the blueprints, though I made a show of studying them carefully. They were about centering myself, remembering who I'd become rather than who I used to be. The woman Stefan had abandoned would have panicked at this moment, would have spent those minutes rehearsing apologies or preparing to justify her choices. The woman I'd become was simply curious to see what Stefan thought he could accomplish with this surprise visit. When Sarah opened the door, the contrast was immediately stark. I'd remembered Stefan as commanding, authoritative, someone who filled whatever room he entered with his presence. The man who walked into my office looked diminished, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his confident posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone under enormous pressure. Rick looked even worse. The charming rebel who'd orchestrated my humiliation in that Vegas casino now appeared haggard and desperate, his eyes darting around my office as if cataloging everything he saw for future reference. "Hello, Stefan," I said without standing up, keeping my tone professionally polite. "Rick, this is unexpected." Stefan's eyes swept across my office, taking in the awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of downtown Las Vegas. I could see him trying to reconcile the successful business executive behind the mahogany desk with the dependent wife he'd left behind. "Jesus, Bridget," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. "Look at this place. Look at you." I go by Miss Seymour now, I replied. And yes, I've done well for myself. Please sit down. What brings you to Las Vegas? Stefan and Rick exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Rick nodded slightly, and Stefan moved forward to take one of the chairs facing my desk. Up close, I could see the strain in his face, the weight he'd lost, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. We need your help, Stefan said without preamble. I know I don't have any right to ask, but I'm desperate. Help with what, specifically? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The federal charges. The investigation. Stefan leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in despite his obvious distress. They're claiming I stole $3 million over 5 years, but they can't prove intent to defraud. If you could testify about our financial arrangements during the marriage, about how you helped manage our investments. He wanted me to lie for him. To claim that I'd been involved in the financial decisions that had actually been entirely under his control, thereby providing him with plausible deniability about the theft from his law firm's escrow accounts. You want me to commit perjury, I said flatly. I want you to tell the truth about our partnership, Stefan replied, slipping into the persuasive tone he'd probably used with juries. You were involved in our financial planning. You understood our investment strategy. You could explain to the jury that any irregularities were the result of complicated financial management, not criminal intent. Rick finally spoke up, his voice carrying the same casual cruelty I remembered from that night in the casino. Come on, Bridget, you owe him this much. He supported you for 5 years while you played house. Time to return the favor. The words were clearly calculated to provoke the same shame and guilt that had once made me compliant. But instead of the familiar twist of inadequacy, I felt something closer to pity. These two men had traveled across the country to ask the woman they'd publicly humiliated to save them from the consequences of their own criminal behavior. I see, I said, leaning back in my chair. And what exactly are you offering in exchange for this partnership in perjury? Stefan's face brightened slightly, interpreting my question as negotiating rather than rejection. Half of everything. Once this legal mess is resolved, we split all the assets 50-50. The house, the investments, everything. What investments, Stefan? What assets? I asked, genuinely curious. According to the news reports, the FBI has frozen everything you own as proceeds from criminal activity. The hope in Stefan's eyes flickered and died. That's temporary, once I'm cleared of the charges. You mean once I help you avoid conviction for crimes you actually committed, I clarified. Rick leaned forward aggressively. Look, Princess, you can play high and mighty all you want, but you benefited from that money too. You lived in that house, wore those clothes, ate at those restaurants. You were complicit whether you knew it or not. I stood up slowly, my chair rolling back smoothly on its expensive casters. Stefan and Rick's eyes followed me as I walked around the desk to face them directly, and I saw the moment when they realized that the power dynamic in this room was nothing like what they'd expected. Gentlemen, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned from managing million-dollar budgets and difficult employees, I think it's time for you to leave. Stefan's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally a flash of the anger I remembered from our worst fights. Bridget, you can't be serious. I'm facing 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. Then you should have thought about that before you started stealing from your clients, I replied, moving to stand behind my desk again, using the physical barrier to emphasize the distance between who I'd been and who I'd become. This is insane, Rick interjected, jumping to his feet. You're gonna let your husband rot in prison because of some grudge about Vegas? Grow up, Bridget. That was almost a year ago. You're right, I said calmly. It was almost a year ago. A year during which neither of you made any attempt to contact me, apologize, or even check whether I was alive. A year during which you both apparently assumed I'd crawled back to Boston and resumed my life as if nothing had happened. Stefan stood as well, his lawyer instincts recognizing that he was losing control of the situation. We tried to find you. We called hospitals, filed missing person reports. You called Charlotte and told her I'd had a mental breakdown after a fictional miscarriage, I interrupted, my voice hardening. You created an elaborate story about my declining mental health to explain my disappearance, ensuring that anyone who might have helped me would dismiss me as unstable. The color drained from Stefan's face. He'd forgotten that lies have a way of catching up with liars, especially when federal investigators start interviewing family members and asking detailed questions about timelines and inconsistencies. We were worried, Stefan stammered. We didn't know what had happened to you. What happened to me, I said, pulling out my phone and quickly scrolling to a recent news article, is that I built this. I turned the screen toward them, showing a photograph from last month's Nevada Business Journal cover story. Desert Rose Enterprises CEO Bridget Seymour. Building community-focused gaming for the future. The article detailed my rise from financial analyst to casino executive, complete with profit projections and expansion timelines. Rick grabbed the phone, staring at the article with obvious shock. Holy shit, Bridget, you're actually famous. I'm actually successful, I corrected. There's a difference. Stefan sank back into his chair, the full reality of my transformation finally hitting him. You don't need us anymore, he said quietly. I never needed you, Stefan. I just thought I did because you convinced me I was incapable of taking care of myself. I walked around to face him directly. You abandoned me in Vegas to prove how dependent I was on you. Instead, you proved how much stronger I was without you. But we're family, Stefan said desperately, grasping for any connection that might move me. We were married for 8 years. That has to count for something. I thought about the partnership papers on my desk, the expansion plans that would make me independently wealthy, the employees who depended on me for their livelihoods, the community I'd helped build around honest work and mutual respect. It does count for something, I agreed. It taught me exactly what kind of person I never want to be again. Rick stood up abruptly, his face flushing with anger. You know what, Stefan? Forget this bitch. She always thought she was better than us anyway. Let her keep her little casino and her fake success. We'll figure something else out. There is nothing else, Stefan said, his voice hollow with defeat. The prosecutors have everything. Bank records, client testimony, documentation of every transfer. Without someone to testify that there was legitimate justification for the account movements. Find someone else, I said simply. Find someone who owes you favors. Or someone you can pay. Or someone who actually believes your version of events. But don't ask the woman you publicly humiliated and abandoned to risk federal charges to save you from the consequences of your own crimes. Stefan looked up at me with something approaching desperation. What do you want, money? I know I don't have much liquid capital right now, but once this is resolved. I want you to leave, I said, walking to my office door and opening it. I want you to walk out of this building, get back on whatever plane brought you here, and never contact me again. And if I don't? Stefan asked, a last flicker of his old arrogance showing through. I smiled, feeling the full weight of everything I'd built over the past year. Then I'll call my attorney, the one who specializes in federal criminal defense, and we'll discuss whether there are additional charges that should be filed related to your treatment of marital assets during our divorce proceedings. The threat landed exactly as intended. Stefan's face went ashen as he realized I now had the resources and expertise to make his legal problems significantly worse. You've changed, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. I have. Stefan stood up slowly, his movements carrying the defeated posture of a man who'd finally realized that his last desperate gambit had failed completely. He looked around my office one more time, his eyes lingering on the framed newspaper articles, the expansion plans, the evidence of a success he could never have imagined I was capable of achieving. I guess this is goodbye then, he said, extending his hand as if we were concluding a business meeting rather than ending the most important relationship of his adult life. I looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, remembering the last time I'd trusted him, the night he'd offered to carry my credit cards because my purse was too full. The night that had set in motion everything that followed. "Goodbye, Stefan," I said, but I didn't take his hand. Rick had been unusually quiet during the final exchange, but as they reached the door, he turned back with one last attempt at the cruel manipulation that had once been so effective. "You know this won't last, right?" he said, gesturing dismissively at my office. "Gambling businesses fail all the time. When this place goes under and you're back to being nobody, don't come crying to us for help." I walked back to my desk and picked up the morning's Las Vegas Review-Journal, folded to the business section. "Rick, before you leave, I want to show you something." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to engage further, but curiosity won out. I handed him the newspaper, pointing to a small article in the lower right corner of the page. "Local casino network announces major partnership," Rick read aloud, his voice growing quieter as he absorbed the details. "Desert Rose Enterprises has signed a development agreement with MGM Resorts International for a new community gaming concept, projected revenue of $200 million over 5 years, innovative profit-sharing model to be implemented across 10 locations." He looked up from the paper, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. "MGM? You're partnering with MGM?" "The announcement goes public Monday," I said. "We're pioneering a new model for community-based gaming that the major casinos want to franchise nationwide. 20 locations by year 3, 50 by year 5. Stefan reached for the paper, scanning the article with the desperate intensity of someone looking for a lifeline. "Bridget, if you're going to be worth this much money, surely you could." "No," I said firmly. "Stefan, I want you to understand something. When you abandoned me in that casino, you thought you were teaching me a lesson about dependence. You thought you were proving that I needed you more than you needed me." I walked around my desk to face both brothers directly. "But what you actually did was set me free. You removed every safety net, every excuse for staying small, every reason to limit myself to supporting someone else's dreams. You forced me to discover what I was really capable of when I stopped waiting for permission to succeed." Rick crumpled the newspaper in his hands, his face twisted with frustration. "So what, you're supposed to thank us for abandoning you?" "I'm supposed to live my life," I replied, "and that's exactly what I've done." Stefan made one last attempt, his voice carrying the desperate charm that had once been so persuasive. "Bridget, please, I know I made mistakes, but we could start over. We could build something together now that you've proven what you can accomplish." The offer hung in the air between us, and for just a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what that might look like. Stefan and Rick as junior partners in my casino empire, dependent on my success, grateful for whatever role I chose to give them in the life I'd built. It would have been a perfect revenge, to make them as dependent on me as I'd once been on Stefan, to reverse the power dynamic completely and watch them scramble for my approval. But revenge, I realized, was just another form of being controlled by people who no longer deserved any influence over my choices. "I already have partners," I said simply, "people who believed in me when I had nothing, who trusted me with responsibility, who treated me as an equal from the beginning. I don't need to build something with you, Stefan. I've already built something better without you." Sarah appeared in my doorway, professional concern evident in her expression. "Miss Seymour, your 2:30 appointment is here." I looked at my watch. "Marcus Chen, here to finalize the MGM partnership contracts that would make me wealthier than Stefan could have imagined possible, even when his stolen money had funded our most extravagant lifestyle." "Send him in, Sarah," I said, then turned back to Stefan and Rick. "Gentlemen, I have a business meeting. You know the way out." Stefan nodded slowly, finally accepting that there would be no dramatic reconciliation, no last-minute salvation, no return to the relationship that had once defined both our lives. As they walked toward the door, Rick turned back one final time. "You know what the funny thing is, Bridget? We actually did you a favor that night in Vegas. We just didn't know it." "No," I said, settling back into my chair as Marcus entered with his briefcase full of contracts that would secure my future. "I did myself a favor. You just got out of my way." 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse apartment, looking out over the Las Vegas skyline as the sun set behind the mountains in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The MGM partnership had exceeded every projection we'd made. 12 locations were already operational, with 8 more scheduled to open before the end of the year. The profit-sharing model had become the industry standard, copied by major casino corporations across the country. My phone buzzed with a text from Edie, now the regional operations manager overseeing our Nevada locations. "Boss, you need to see the quarterly numbers. We're gonna need a bigger champagne budget for the celebration party." I smiled, remembering the first employee appreciation dinner when I'd been amazed by the simple fact that I belonged somewhere. Now I was hosting quarterly celebration events for over 300 employees across 4 states, all of them sharing in the success of something we'd built together. The doorbell rang, and I walked back inside to answer it. Carmen, my former apartment building manager, stood in the hallway holding a bottle of wine and wearing the biggest smile I'd ever seen from her. "Bridget, honey, I had to come see this place myself," she said, stepping into the spacious apartment that could have easily contained 20 copies of Studio 14B. "When you told me you were moving out, I figured you'd gotten a promotion. I didn't figure you'd gotten an empire." I laughed, giving her the hug she'd earned through months of practical kindness when I'd had nothing to offer in return. "I still remember what you told me that first day, that I had the look of someone who was tougher than they thought they were." "Hell, honey, I was wrong about that," Carmen said, accepting a glass of wine as we settled onto the couch. "You weren't tougher than you thought. You were tougher than anyone thought, including yourself." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights come on across the city below. Carmen had become more than just a former landlord. She was one of the few people who knew the complete story of my transformation, who understood the journey from abandoned wife to casino executive without judgment or amazement. "You hear anything more about Stefan?" she asked eventually. 18 months in federal prison, plus restitution," I replied. "His law license was revoked, obviously. Charlotte says he's trying to write a book about his experience, but no publisher is interested." "And Rick?" "Rick disappeared after the sentencing. Charlotte thinks he might be in Florida, but she's not sure," I shrugged. "It doesn't matter. They're not part of my story anymore." Carmen raised her wine glass in a mock toast. "To not being part of anyone's story but your own." "I'll drink to that," I agreed. Later that evening, after Carmen had left, I walked back out onto the balcony. Tomorrow would bring another day of board meetings, expansion plans, and the constant challenges of running a business that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in revenue. But tonight, I just wanted to appreciate how far I'd traveled from the woman who'd stood in a casino almost 2 years ago, abandoned with $43 and no idea what would happen next. My phone rang, and Bart's familiar voice filled the line. "Hey, partner, just wanted to let you know the Atlantic City deal went through. We'll be opening our first East Coast location in 6 months." "That's wonderful news," I said, though I was hardly surprised. Everything we touched seemed to turn to gold these days, not through luck, but through careful planning and the kind of ethical business practices that built sustainable success. "You know what the best part is?" Bart continued. "The location is in New Jersey, about 4 hours from Boston. Maybe some of those fancy people who used to dismiss you will get a chance to see what you built." I thought about our old social circle, the wives of Stefan's colleagues who treated me like an amusing accessory to their husbands' careers. The idea of them discovering that the woman they'd once pitied for her dependence had built something that made their husbands' achievements look small by comparison did have a certain poetic justice. But it didn't matter anymore. I hadn't built this empire to prove anything to Stefan or his world. I'd built it because I could, because it was satisfying work that made a difference in people's lives, and because it belonged entirely to me. "You know what, Bart?" I said, watching the city lights twinkle below like earthbound stars. "I don't think I care whether they notice or not. I didn't do this for them." "Who did you do it for?" I thought about the question for a moment, remembering the terrified woman who'd pawned her wedding ring in a hotel gift shop, the desperate job applicant who'd owned nothing but thrift store clothes, the casino analyst who'd worked 18-hour days to prove her worth to a skeptical boss. "I did it for her," I said finally. For the woman who deserved better than she was getting, who was stronger than anyone believed, who just needed someone to get out of her way so she could build something amazing. After I hung up, I stood on that balcony for a long time, thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment. Stefan's abandonment had been intended as punishment, a lesson about the consequences of challenging his authority. Instead, it had been liberation, the push I'd needed to discover what I was truly capable of when I stopped asking permission to succeed. Sometimes the cruelest actions yield the greatest gifts. Sometimes being abandoned is really being set free. And sometimes the biggest mistake someone can make is underestimating the person they think they've defeated. Stefan thought he was teaching me about dependence. Instead, he accidentally reminded me about independence. And now, looking out over a city where I'd built an empire from nothing, I couldn't help but think that was the best lesson I'd ever learned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.